Greetings. My name is Stan Prager from the Regarp book blog, www.regarp.com. Today's podcast features my review of Let My Country Awake, Indian Revolutionaries in America and the Fight to Overthrow the British Raj by Scott Miller. It has been said that the United States is a nation of immigrants that despises immigrants. At first glance, that seems counterintuitive and smacks of hyperbole, but simmering beneath the satire lies more than a single kernel of truth. Benjamin Franklin worried that German immigrants might alter the character of the Republic for the worse. In 1798, just a decade after the Constitution was ratified, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed. A massive influx of the Irish fleeing starvation during the potato famine fueled a nativist panic in the 1850s that brought the Know-Nothing Party to national prominence. The heinous Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882. 20 years later, Woodrow Wilson complained of the coming of multitudes of men of the lowest class from the south of Italy and men of the meaner sort out of Hungary and Poland, as if the countries of the south of Europe were disburdening themselves of the more sordid and hapless elements of their population. Such sentiments were codified into law with the Immigration Act of 1924 that set strict national quotas not abolished until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. 60 years later, the news is dominated by ICE roundups across the country and detainment centers like Alligator Alcatraz, with the president even citing a statute from the Alien and Sedition Acts to justify his wide-scale crackdown on the undocumented. I was long familiar with this history, but what was entirely new to me was that just a few years after Wilson was bemoaning the meaner sorts from certain parts of Europe flooding American shores to the east, on the West Coast, there was a full-scale race riot in Bellingham, Washington, about 90 miles north of Seattle, that saw mobs violently physically assault and eventually expel hundreds of immigrants from India who had been working at lumber mills in the vicinity. Nor was I cognizant of the fact, although perhaps I should have guessed, that in this Jim Crow era, citizenship was largely out of reach for South Asian emigres, because white supremacy jealously guarded that privilege. I was also surprised to learn that the same University of California, Berkeley, that was the hotbed for student anti-war sentiment in the 1960s, was in the early 1900s home to an increasingly radicalized community of Indian expatriates who, while struggling against discrimination in the U.S., became laser-focused upon overthrowing British rule back home on the subcontinent, spawning the Revolutionary Ghadar movement. And I was completely unaware that the machinations of Ghadar operatives came to jeopardize the neutrality enforced by now President Wilson, as World War I raged in Europe, while Germans and Brits competed to alternately court or persecute these insurgents abroad. Finally, I had no clue that the activities of these Indians became one of the key ingredients that drove passage of the lesser-known Immigration Act of 1917 that established an Asiatic barred zone and banned so-called undesirables from entering the countries. That's a lot to unpack, but Scott Miller proves more than up to the task in his latest work, Let My Country Awake, Indian Revolutionaries in America and the Fight to Overthrow the British Raj, scheduled for publication in October 2025. A well-researched, highly readable, and fast-moving account that manages, in less than 300 pages, to brilliantly capture a long-neglected, if pivotal, series of events that touch 3 continents with some consequence. Moreover, Miller's critical eye for detail and talented prose masterfully reaches back more than a century to breathe life into colorful characters who walk the earth no longer. These include Indian activists Lala Hardayal and Taraknath Das, the villainous Canadian immigration agent William Hopkinson, noted anarchist Emma Goldman, pioneering female jurist Annette Adams, Assistant Attorney General Charles Warren, and a whole host of British and German diplomats and spies. Likewise, episodes long forgotten, or at least neglected elsewhere, are skillfully slotted back into the historical narrative to fill in some highly significant blanks that speak to the recurring fever of rising nativism in North America, as well as a pre-Gandhi Indian nationalism that was fierce and transoceanic. The prevailing wisdom has long been that British imperialism represented a kinder and gentler subjugation for its inhabitants than they might have suffered had they been conquered by the Belgians, French, or Germans. Perhaps, but also perhaps not. Tasmanian novelist Richard Flanagan would remind you that British colonists directed the genocide that resulted in the near extermination of Aborigines in what was then Van Diemen's Land. British soldiers used machine guns to mow down thousands of Ndebele warriors in southern Africa in the 1890s. Non-white combatants clearly were not treated with the kind of civilized restraint that would have been afforded fellow Europeans during and after hostilities. This was also true in India, occupied by England since the 18th century. In the process of putting down the Sepoy, also known as Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British killed more than 800,000 Indians. Miller notes that a popular method of executing Indian rebels was a technique termed blowing from a gun that had the condemned strapped to the mouth of a cannon, which when fired created a grisly public spectacle as the body was blown to bits. In 1858, India was placed under direct crown rule, known as the British Raj, which endured until independence came in 1947. But these atrocities were never forgotten by the Indian people, nor its activists at home or abroad. Because we were allied with England back then, and remain favorably disposed to the UK today, it is easy to forget that despite our antipathy towards the wanton aggression and brutal conduct of Germany in World War I, taking sides was not such a clear-cut process for the subjects of British colonial rule. Sir Roger Casement, a British diplomat famous for helping to expose the inhumanity that reigned over King Leopold's Belgian Congo, was also an Irish nationalist who was stripped of his knighthood and then hanged for treason during the war. As we learn more about the routine oppression of Indians under the thumb of the Raj, it is not at all surprising that Ghadar conspirators would welcome collaboration with German agents in the U.S. to help achieve their ends, while the British naturally would do everything they could to derail such efforts. It is the unlikely confluence of people and events in the United States, Canada, Europe, and the Indian subcontinent as global war is breaking out that makes Let My Country Awake such a fascinating tale, especially since much of what Miller covers here is hardly familiar ground. Apparently, it was once just as obscure to the author himself. It turns out that a random headline reporting the Bellingham race riot, unexpectedly spotted in a museum display, planted the seeds for what evolved into this book. As such, I do attach some comfort to the fact that I am not the only student of American history wondering at my own ignorance in this regard. On the other hand, just like the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, incidents such as these had a way of being overlooked in the textbooks assigned to me back in the day. Miller, a former international correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and other outlets, knows how to take a good story and run with it, as he did in The President and the Assassin, McKinley, Terror, and Empire at the Dawn of the American Century, which also established his reputation chronicling history that meets the standards of academia while appealing to a much broader audience. In his latest effort, as a critic, I struggled to find fault, but I could detect few flaws other than in the book's title, plucked from a poem by Rabindranath Tagore, which, while relevant, strikes me as a somewhat dull designation for such a vibrant, exciting work. Spoiler alert, Ghadar does not succeed in toppling the Raj, but along the way, the author treats us to plenty of action and intrigue marked by espionage, plots and counterplots, cloakroom diplomacy, courtroom drama, and assassinations. The unstated irony in Let My Country Awake is that few residents of the United States, which had fought 2 wars for independence against Britain, found sympathy in the plight of the Indians chafing under the weight of British colonialism. Nor were they welcomed as refugees. Instead, as people of color with an alien culture and religion, they were mostly shunned and detested, or violently driven off as at Bellingham in 1907. In the course of the narrative, Miller relates the unsettling tale of Bhagat Singh Thind, a U.S. Army veteran who skirted customary prohibitions against naturalization by arguing that as a Sikh, high-caste Indian, he was effectively white. Thind attempted to co-opt white supremacy, and at first he succeeded. Citizenship was granted, but then stripped away in a subsequent Supreme Court ruling that Thind was not really white, and non-white immigrants were ineligible to be American citizens, which also resulted in retroactively revoking the naturalization of more than 70 other Indians. There was a time when I believed that we were moving away from all that as a nation. Thind actually had his citizenship restored in 1935, but I no longer hold that view. Still, whether you choose to hang on to optimism or pessimism when it comes to such things, whether your glass is half full or half empty or simply shattered, the historical record matters. The more you know about the past, the better you can perceive the present, and the more it can inform your vision of what lies ahead, however you conceive it. To that end, then, this is an important book that I would urge you to read, as simply a chapter of our past, or perhaps as a parable for our future. Thank you for joining me for today's podcast. I encourage you to share it in your network. Many more reviews and an eclectic array of fiction and nonfiction books are available at regarp.com and regarpbookblogpod.com. Have a great day.